And listen, here why I bring this up and why it's important, I think we learn from Terah's story is that it's important that while there will come seasons, there are going to come seasons where you're going to need to stop, where you need to rest, where you need to pull over in life. It's important that we not let the rest area become our final resting place in life. It's important that we don't settle where God never called you to live. That you don't settle where God never called you to live. And look, we all know people who've done this. Maybe you're one of those people here tonight. You've just settled in a place God never called you to live in. You built a house where you were only supposed to pop up a tent. Maybe it's a place in your marriage. No one's calling, the attorney and filing divorce papers or anything like that, but you just sort of settled in your marriage. You quit pursuing, you quit chasing, you just settled. Maybe it was a dream or a call that God put on your life, maybe to step out and get involved in ministry or to pursue a new career or pursue a new business opportunity. But for whatever reason, you just settled. Kind of like those resolutions you thought, oh, it'll never be any different. I can't do this. I've failed before, so I'm sure I'll just fail again. And that's kind of what we see with Terah. We see this guy who chooses to settle in a place God never called him to live. And so here in this journey to Terah, he's making about a 1,000-mile journey from Ur, and he gets a little more than halfway there. He gets about 600 miles in. Again, stopping a whole lot of times along the way, right? Because that's what Terah does. And in doing so, he kind of speaks to us, and I think shares with us sort of the three main reasons I think so many of us stop short of where God is calling us to do and get to in life. They're the reasons why so many of us tend to settle in a place we were never meant to live. And the first thing we see is a painful past. A painful past. See, some of us, our pain paralyzes our progress. Painful experiences can cause us just to stop, right? And listen, you don't have to live very long before you have a little bit of pain in your life. You don't have to live very long. I mean, before you realize that pain is something we all face. It's kind of like you go to the doctor's office and they got that pain scale from like 1 to 10, and just tell me how bad does it hurt? Which I don't know why they ever put 1 to 5 on there, because if you pick 1 to 5, you're just setting yourself up for like a 5-hour wait for the doctor to actually return to you, right? No, but we all experience some pain, and you don't have to live very long before you know what that's like. In fact, I was thinking about this, and there was a video of a preschooler talking about her first day in preschool. I want you to take a look at this video. Apparently, it was a really hard video because this was a hard day for her because she doesn't have anything to say. So, oh, bummer. Yeah, sorry. That video, unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it wants to work. But basically, she just complains the whole day about her preschool day and moment and how horrible it was. A painful day at preschool. And again, listen, you don't have to live very long before you and I, we face pain. Maybe we face a painful experience, a painful failure, a painful disappointment, maybe a painful loss. And that's what we find in Terah's road trip. At the heart of why he stopped short, at the heart of why he settled, we see a tragedy occur. And we see it in verse 28. It says, "But Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living." And now, who was Haran? Well, Haran was Terah's son. He lost a son. And I'll be honest, I can't imagine a more tragic, more heartbreaking circumstance to face, something that seems so unnatural than having to bury your own son. And that's exactly what Terah is faced with. And yet Terah, instead of really kind of grieving it, really going through the process, really dealing with the loss, he decides to just kind of continue on with this road trip. To just try to kind of press on and just kind of hope that the pain will just kind of dissipate, the pain will just kind of go away. But look what happens in Genesis 11:31. It says, "One day Terah moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans. He was headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran and settled there." Now wait a second. Does the name sound a little familiar? Haran, in the verse just before that, Haran was the name of his son. the name of his hurt, the name of his pain, the name of his loss. And yet, in verse 31, we see him stopping, getting stuck in a place that literally has the same name as the son he just lost. Getting stuck in that place of pain, getting stuck in that place of hurt and heartache and wound and tragedy. He settles in a place that's name is synonymous with his greatest pain. And in doing so, it speaks to us something I think we got to get is that, listen, if your pain goes unhealed, your potential will go unrealized. If your pain goes unhealed, your potential will go unrealized. See, you cannot step into all that God has for you, all that God wants for you, as long as you have this unresolved pain, this unresolved guilt, this unresolved heartache. And that's what Tehran was doing. He was sitting there saying, just attempting to kind of sweep it under the rug, try to create some distance, try to cover up, and try to just kind of gloss over this pain, and just hoping that somehow it would dissipate, somehow the pain would lessen. But he never actually sought to actually find healing from that pain. And as a result, he finds himself in the very place that was synonymous with the deepest, most tragic pain in his life. And listen, some of us do the same. When we come to church, we act like it's all right and everything's all great and everything's good. But listen, if that pain goes unresolved, if you never really surrender it to God, allow God to do a healing work in your life, I'm telling you, you'll end up settling in the very same place that Terah did, a painful place, a heartbreaking place, a place you were never meant to live. You know, interesting enough, going back to names meaning something, that name Haran actually means mountain. Actually means mountain. He comes to this mountainous place, again, and he stops because it's hard. And it's the same reason why a lot of us, we don't want to deal with the pain. We don't want to deal with the heartache. And we don't want to deal with the tragedy. We don't want to deal with the loss because it hurts. It hurts. It's hard. It's a struggle. It's a pain. And truth is that sometimes it's easier to camp out in your pain than to climb over it, right? It's easier to just camp out in it. Or to try to escape it like Tehran, maybe escape it with alcohol, maybe escape it with work, or try to escape it with another relationship. But again, if your pain goes unhealed, your potential will go unrealized. And by the way, this is why this ideal of grace is so important when it comes to the healing process. Oftentimes, whenever I do a wedding, and there's a groom and a bride, oftentimes share with them of, kind of Jewish tradition, how they would typically marry a bride and a groom, is that they would bring the bride and groom before the priest, and the priest would take a knife, and he would make a small incision in the palm of their hands. And they would take their hands, close them together, and kind of tie them up with a rope. And it was symbolic of two things. It was symbolic, one, of two lives becoming one, but it was also symbolic of grace. Symbolic of grace. And it was this ideal that, so often we think that relationships that go the distance and are thriving and growing, that it's all because they're mainly connected with a good communication or romance or pursuing. But truth is that relationships that go the distance, relationships that where the love kind of keeps overflowing, is relationships that have grace as the glue in that relationship. This ideal of loving people when they deserve it the least and need it the most. And in saying that, you got to understand this is more than just, I didn't share that just to give you like relationship advice. This is life advice. Because see, grace and forgiveness, this ideal of forgiveness, of letting go, surrendering it to God, this isn't about glossing over the pain. This isn't about, just forgetting what was done to you or maybe what you did to someone else. No, grace is choosing to just not get stuck there. Grace is choosing to just not get stuck there. It's choosing to not get stuck in the disappointment, choosing to not get stuck in the failure, choosing to not get stuck in that mistake. But here's the thing with grace is that we don't just need grace just for the bad things done to us. We especially need grace during the times when maybe good things or good people are lost from us. I had a friend in Vancouver, and it was years ago. One of the most, again, tragic things you could possibly have happen. His son was about 18, died in a car crash, and I just remember just sitting with him, grieving with him, just how heartbreaking and just scary. I mean, you don't know what to say, you don't know what to do. All you can do is just sit there and just hold him and hug him, and I just never forget just the look on his face and just the agony and the pain. And I'll never forget, it was about 2 weeks after that, he shows up to church, and there's this guy who just kind of just gets right up in his face and just starts berating him. And just says, "Hey, look, God told me to tell you that you just need to move on. You just need to put this loss behind you." And I'll never. I remember walking up to the guy, and I kind of led him to the side. And I'd love to tell you it was one of the more pastoral conversations, but truthfully, it was far from that. Because the truth is, when you go through tragedy, listen, you never just move on from grief and loss. You don't. You don't just move on from it. There's always going to be some scars. But listen, while you never move on from grief and loss, you can move forward through it with God's help. And why I say grace is so important is that there's some of you that are going through grace or going through grief or going through loss of someone you care about and you love so much. And listen, you need to know that there's grace, and it's okay to spend some time to grieve. It's okay. In fact, you should. In fact, there's some of you, in fact, the Bible says grieve with one another. There's a time, there's a season. Ecclesiastes says there's a time and a season for everything. There's a time to rejoice. There's a time to cry. There's a time for grief. There's a time to wrestle with those emotions. But here's the thing, is that while there's a season, while there's a time, that season's not meant to be for a lifetime. You're not meant to live there. You're not. Put a tent there, yes. Grieve, and grieve with one another. Grieve with a community, yes. But don't build a house there. Don't settle there. Listen, you'll never move on necessarily totally from your grief and your loss, but you can move forward through it with God's help. So this is the second thing, and the reason why a lot of us get stuck is simply negative relationships that hold us back. People who don't propel us to our purpose, but rather they pull us back to his place of pause or stop or just settling. That's what we see in Terah's story. Genesis 11:31 says, one day Terah took his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarah, and his grandson Lot, and they moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans. And then it goes on, it says, get this, he was headed for the land of Canaan. He was headed to the promised land. But they stopped at Haran and settled there. He was going one direction. He was going the place that God called him to go, but they stopped. They chose to settle. They chose to go a different direction. See, some of you haven't figured out why you ended up stalled and stuck in the same place that you were last year and the year before that and the year before that. You don't know why you keep living in the same places, because you had your destination all figured out, like Terah. You were going to follow God. You were going to pursue him. You were going to start that business. You were going to step out in that ministry. Like Terah. I mean, he was on his way there. He had an eye toward the prize. He had an eye toward the promised land. He was going there. And the interesting thing is, you'd think the guy that's name means stop, that it would be his ideal to actually stop, but it wasn't. He was pressing on. But no, it was their ideal. Their ideal to stop short. Their ideal to settle in a place he was never meant to live. And I shared about this about a month ago, but it's so true, is that who you ride with in your journey with Christ matters. Who you ride with, who's on your trip matters. In fact, I put on my notes this way, is never let someone take the wheel of your life who doesn't share your destination and determination. Because look, I think some of you, you've got some days in your life who are restricting you from God's purpose, who keep pulling you back into some bad habits, keep pulling you back into some bad tendencies, keep pulling you back into a place that you were never meant to live and you were never meant to just settle in. Because here's the truth, is that you'll never get to the right place if you travel with the wrong people. You'll never get to the right place if you travel with the wrong people. And you sit there and say, oh, I'll just convert them, I'll change them, they'll be different. No. What's going to end up happening is exactly what happened to Terah. You'll end up settling in the place you were never meant to live. And like Terah, he ended up dying in that very place of his pain, of his heartache, of his wound. But here's the good news in all this, is that conversely, if you're with the right people, you always get to the right destination. If you're with the right people, you get to the right destination. By the way, this is why it's so important to not neglect the meeting, the fellowship with fellow believers, right? So some of you, the greatest resolution you can make to experience truly a new year in 2018 is just a commitment to just be a part of a church community. It's just being around some people, being in a faith community of people who are praying for you, who actually get beyond the mass of your life and say, look, man, I'm here for you. You need to keep going. I believe in you. I believe God's got a purpose for you, more than just what you're settling into, more than just what you're living for. A faith community of people that speak faith constantly over you. Listen, you've got to get some people in your life, especially if you have that Terah tendency to want to stop short, that keep pushing you forward, keep saying, man, you keep going, keep at it. Don't give up, don't stop. Not yet. This leads to the final reason that I think a lot of us settle in places we were never meant to live, and that's a praiseless pause. A praiseless pause. Eventually, Terah would end up settling and ultimately passing away in the town of Haran, unable to move past the pain, unable to move beyond the pool of they. And so Abram would be called to fulfill the journey Terah had originally set out to complete. And we see this in Genesis 12, verses 4 through 5 says, so Abram departed as the Lord had instructed and headed for the land of Canaan. And I love this. Notice, this is where things start to happen a little differently. Abram, he approaches this a very different way than his father did before him. And we see this in Genesis 12:7. It says, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. This is God speaking his promises, reminding him of his promises, reminding him of his plan for Abram. It says, and Abram, get this, built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. See, the interesting thing in Terah's life is that Terah's life would be bookended by two amazing giants of the faith. We see Noah. Noah in Hebrews 11 is referred to as by faith, a man of faith. And interesting enough, Noah oftentimes would build an altar. This place of just pausing and just giving praise, worshiping our God. And then on the other end of Terah's life, we see Abraham doing the exact same thing. Building an altar, stopping, giving praise, stopping to worship our God. And yet, interesting enough, Terah never once, as it mentioned, ever built an altar. Never once does he stop and slow down to worship God. And listen, I share this because just as important as it is not to build a house where you were meant to just build a tent, don't put a tent where you were meant to put an altar. Don't get so busy and so rushed in life where you're just constantly going and constantly moving. You never take time to just slow down and pause. And in that pause, take time to praise. Take time to worship our God. See, every pause needs a praise. Every pause needs a praise. And listen, there's going to be times where life, sometimes by your own doing, a lot of times not. That's going to force you to stop, force you to slow down, where you hit a rest area, where you hit a curb in the road, you hit a gas station, you're just stuck there and you're stopped. And listen, it's in that moment you and I have a choice, and it's not to sink or swim, it's to sink or sing. You can choose to complain, you can choose to just accept defeat, and you can just choose to just settle in a place you were never meant to live, or you can choose to lift your eyes to heaven, to worship God, to give praise in the pause. And that's what we see in Abram's life. We see this pattern played out. Genesis 12:8 says, from where he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. It goes on in verses chapter 13, 17 through 18. It says, so Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. Genesis 22:9, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there. You see the pattern? Every time he hit a pause, he stopped to give praise. And listen, before you sit there and think, oh, well, that's Abraham. He was a great man of faith. It's easy for him. Listen, it was not always easy for Abraham to stop and give praise. There were more than a few times Abraham probably did not feel like giving praise to God in that moment. Probably the most significant time was in Genesis 22. Verses 1 through 2, we see God calling him to take his one and only son. Abraham had been waiting 100 years to have this son, this promise of a son, only to have God call him to take him to the top of this mountain and sacrifice him. And here's Abraham's response. Genesis 22, 1 through 2. God said to him, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah on a mountain I will show you. And so he takes him, and it goes on, it says, verses 4 through 5 says, on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place. Which I would think by the third day, I would have, found some way to skedaddle out of town, right? Go the other, God, were you talking to me? I'm on the other side of the country. But he goes on, he said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. And I love this. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. See, there's a couple of significant things